Hello, and welcome to Woodworking for Miniaturists. This episode on wood originally ran close to 40 minutes, and according to my in-house critic, needed to be cut down by half, and so now it exists in 2 episodes. This is episode 1. Enjoy!
Welcome to Woodworking for Miniaturists. The first human use of wood may have been as a club to scramble the brains of an aggressive or tasty animal or an aggressive rival. We learned to improve our weapons after a while, making bows, arrows, spears, and spear throwers, mostly out of wood. In the process, we became increasingly familiar with wood and passed our knowledge on to younger generations, thus establishing the technological culture of wood, which has been evolving ever since. At some point, wood became an important part of our shelters and furnishings, and the playthings that we made for our children, some of which were small representations of our shelters and furnishings. Gradually, we acquired the skills and knowledge to work wood, to cut it, bend it, join it, smooth it, and polish it, so that it would better serve our needs. Along the way, we developed an affinity for wood. We like it. It evokes warm and familiar responses. We have developed many substitutes for wood, metals, plastics, other kinds of fibers, glass, and ceramics, some of which are far superior to wood for their particular purposes. And yet wood remains one of our primary fabrication materials, unsurpassed in many ways. As a substance, wood has certain characteristics that we have to understand in order to make the best use of it. While all wood has certain structures, there is a wide variety between the various species and in the processing and conditioning of wood, which results in not just a single substance, but a wide range of materials, each with its unique qualities and applications. Knowledge of these qualities gives us the power to make wood do what we want, within limits. Limits that we must also understand. Let's take a simple Windsor chair as an example. Made in the traditional way, a Windsor chair uses different species and conditions of wood for the different components. The arched back and arms are made of a wood such as ash, which can be steamed to allow it to bend to the desired shape without breaking or splintering. The legs and stretchers are made of a wood such as cherry or maple, which is strong and can be turned on a lathe to produce attractive shapes and nice finishes. The seat is made of a thick slab of softwood such as pine, which is shaped, bored, and assembled while still green, which is to say undried. As it dries, it will shrink and tighten around the legs and back slats, making the whole assembly tight and strong. The wood for the bent parts and the turned spindles is selected for its species and ease of shaping and bending. The wood for the seat is selected not only for its species, consistency, ease of carving, but for its moisture content, which affects the strength of the joints. The maker has to know their material to be able to predict how the wood will change as its moisture content changes. I've never made a Windsor chair, but I've learned a little bit about how they are made, and this knowledge has improved my work on other projects. All wood has certain general characteristics. Like any solid substance, wood has 3 dimensions in space. Unlike other substances, wood has a relationship between its dimensions and its structure because wood has grain, and grain has direction. To understand grain, think of a bunch of soda straws oriented in the same direction and held together in a cluster. Wood is like that on a microscopic level. The tubes that make up wood are called xylem and phloem. They function like straws. Xylem to draw water and soil nutrients up into the tree, and phloem to carry sugars, which are manufactured in the leaves, to the rest of the tree. This tube structure produces several characteristics of wood. It affects how wood is cut, machined, finished. It affects the nature of wood's strength. It affects how wood can be glued and otherwise joined, and it affects how it looks. The grain of wood even affects what names we give to its dimensions. Here we see a cube of metal, a three-dimensional object which has height, width, and depth. It does not much matter which label you use for which dimension. If it is a consistent material like metal or plastic, which is the same from every angle and all the way through, which dimension you call the height is arbitrary. It'll be determined by your perspective, not by anything inherent to the cube. Look at the cube from a different direction, or flip it up onto one side, and what was the height becomes the width. The names of the dimensions are arbitrary. But wood has grain, strands, which run lengthwise in one of those three dimensions. This means that each of the three dimensions has a particular relationship to the original structure of the tree, and each dimension is identified by that relationship. Let's look at another solid object, this time a wooden board. The thinnest dimension of a board is called the thickness, and that's represented by the letter T. Our example board may be 35 millimeters thick, or we would say T equals 35 millimeters. This dimension, thickness, is always measured across the grain. When you buy sheets of 1/8 inch basswood from Northeastern Lumber Company, that means that the wood that comes to your doorstep will be 1/8 of an inch thick. The next largest dimension of our board is the width, represented by a W. Our board is 250 millimeters wide, or W equals 250 millimeters. One of the criteria of a well-prepared board is that it is flat, and flat is measured across the width of the board. Like the thickness, the width is always measured across the grain, but at a right angle to the thickness, in a direction 90 degrees to the thickness. Now I've begun to talk about angles, geometry, and at some point I'll need to decide whether to include a section on geometry. For now, let's keep it to a discussion of a right angle, which we'll need to understand. If two straight lines, AB and AC here, intersect to form one longer straight line, BC, we say that the two original lines are 180 degrees to each other. A 180-degree angle is a straight line. If two straight lines BC and AD intersect such that the 180 degrees is cut in half, those two lines are 90 degrees relative to each other. That relationship, a 90-degree angle, is critical, and we will rely on it for many things. And it goes by many names. We say the two lines are 90 degrees to each other. We also say they form a square angle. Think about it this way. It takes 4 square angles to form a square. A square is square. Square defines a square. We can also say that the two lines form a right angle. If one of the 3 angles of a triangle is a 90-degree angle, that triangle is called a right triangle. We can also say that the two lines are perpendicular to each other. So if our board is prepared correctly, its thickness is at a 90-degree angle to its width. The longest dimension of a board is its length, represented by the letter L. In our example, our board is 450 millimeters long. L equals 450 millimeters. The length is measured at 90 degrees to the width and to the thickness. Another of our criteria for a well-prepared board is that it is straight. Straight is measured along the length of the board. In the illustration, the dimensions are listed in this order: L by W by T. Sometimes the dimensions of wood are listed in a different order, but the letters consistently tell us which is which. There are 6 surfaces on our board, 2 of each of 3 kinds, each of which has a particular name. The largest surface is defined by the width and the length. It is called the face, and there are 2 of them, one on each side of the board. The long, narrow surface is the edge, and it is defined by the length and the thickness. There are 2 edges, also across from each other. We should note here that when a board is square in cross-section, the face and the edge are the same size, and usually all 4 sides are then called faces. If square stock like this is large, we might call it a beam. If it is very small, we might refer to it as a square dowel. The smallest surface is the end. It is defined by the width and the thickness. There are 2 ends on a board, and we refer to them as this end and that end. The faces and the edges show face grain, lines of grain running from one end to the other. The ends show end grain, the holes at the ends of the tubes, but you can only see those holes usually if you have a powerful magnifier. The difference between a face grain surface and an end grain surface is critical to cutting, gluing, staining, sanding, and finishing. When you think of wood, the image you get in your mind is that of a board, something that tends to be long, with a width that's smaller than the length, but larger than the thickness. Think about why that is. This solid shape turns out to be the most useful shape that something made of wood can take. It is the shape that automatically emerges from the sawmill. It is a shape that maximizes the available strength of wood, which is due to the grain. The longest dimension, the dimension that is measured with the grain, is the dimension along which wood is strongest. The grain of wood determines how it is cut and worked, and it determines what we call the cutting. Cutting wood across the grain is an energy-consuming process called cross-cutting. It produces 2 boards with the same width and thickness as the original, but shorter lengths. Cutting in the same direction as the grain through the width of the board is called ripping. It produces 2 boards with the same length and thickness as the original, but narrower widths. Cutting in the same direction as the grain through the thickness of the board is called resawing. It produces 2 boards with the same length and width as the original, but thinner thickness. Each of these operations can be done with a saw or other hand tools. In fact, long ago that was the only way available. Now all three operations can be done with power tools, much easier and quicker. In miniature work, cross-cutting can usually be done quickly and easily since we're dealing with small pieces and they're not hard to cut through. But as you'll see, power tools tend to reliably produce more precise cuts, even with cross-cutting. Chopping with an axe is a kind of cross-cutting, but it's very imprecise and wasteful. Ripping and resawing can also be done with wedges, but we rarely use those techniques in miniature work. Ripping done by splitting the wood with an axe or wedge is simply called splitting, and is easier and quicker than sawing, because wood is weak along its length. It has much less cohesion between the strands than along them. Splitting tends to be very imprecise compared with ripping with a saw. Splitting is how you turn a section of a log into firewood. You may have read that Abraham Lincoln spent a portion of his youth splitting rails. Rails are the long horizontal parts of a wooden fence. Abe was driving wedges along the length of a log, causing it to split into two smaller half logs, and then splitting those into quarter logs, and so forth, until he had rail-sized pieces. Not even Abe could have done the same trick across the grain. The equivalent of resawing when done with a wedge is called riving, and is done with a wedge called a riving knife. This is how they used to make wooden shingles and thin bands of wood for basket weaving. I suppose you could rive your own miniature shingles, but that would be slow and tedious, and miniature wooden shingles are available pre-made and not expensively. I have woven miniature baskets, but I used strips of card, so no riving was needed. Most of the pieces of wood that we're going to need for miniature work will be sawn. Even small directional differences in the slope of the grain make a difference in how we work and cut wood. When smoothing the edge of a board with a hand plane or a machine joiner, we want to cut with the grain, meaning that the grain is rising towards the far end of the board. Our blade will cut across this small angle of the wood and leave a smooth surface. If the grain is rising towards our end, the end where we started the plane stroke, that is called against the grain. The blade will tend to catch on the ends of the grain and split it out, making the planing difficult and the result very rough. This roughness is called tear out. Let's talk for a moment about wood's figure. We need to distinguish the figure of wood from its grain. The grain of wood is its structure, the direction along which the tubes align. Figure refers to what the grain looks like on the surface of a board or on a component of a piece of furniture. And figure is determined by many things, including the grain, but also how the wood was cut relative to the grain, the pattern of early wood and late wood, the presence and size of any visible rays, how porous the wood is, whether the wood is ring porous or diffuse porous, and whether it's been spalted, stained by rot. Names for various figure patterns include bird's eye, fiddleback, quilted, plain sawn, and quarter sawn. No, this will not be on a test. For now, just think about the analogy of the clustered straws. That is the grain. More about figure later.
So, as promised, we have split this video into two. The second part is called Wood Part 2, so join us for that. And in the meantime, keep the shiny side up.